have open office hours today. This is a opportunity for all of our Ruby students to join us for question and answer. Anything that is on your mind around culinary topics, cooking techniques, ingredients, process, product, food history, anything on your mind is fair game for today's office hour. So this is a really fun time. We usually go for about an hour. If you're new to office hours, to ask a question, it's very simple. Just in that top right text box to the right of where you see me speaking, you can type a question. If you click the black add button, that goes into a quick moderation queue that allows you to put that question into a quick review session before we publish it. When you see a question that you like, click on the heart next to it. That will bump that question up so we get to it just a little bit faster. But otherwise, this is kind of fair game for anything and everything culinary related. We typically try to stay away from questions that are too specific around health or medicine, because I don't want to diagnose or attempt to treat anyone. I'm not a physician. But in some cases, I might ask that you contact us directly or reach out to us through our support channel so that we can directly answer your question that's more private and more personal. But without further ado, just go ahead and jump right in. So got some really amazing questions here today. I've already had a chance to just have a peek at a few of them. So let's go ahead and just jump into this first question. What are your thoughts on German versus Japanese steel material for chef knives? Which are better for which applications? Are blended steel knives a happy medium for the home cook? Yeah, really great question. I would say that for most people, for most home cooks, knowing that they have a sharp, dependable knife is really the first best starting point for cooking. So whether it's a German style knife or a German made knife, of which Wüsthof and Henkel's, Messermeister are going to be some top brands, or whether you're looking more for a Japanese style knife, just having a good knife that's sharp and clean and well maintained, that's really the first best step. When you get into some of the details around the types of steel, the hardness of the steel, applications, weight, these sorts of things, it gets a little bit technical. I would say it's not as critical to be engaged with those sorts of things. They don't necessarily affect performance. They affect kind of the fine details around, how many times you have to sharpen your knife. Does it dull easily on certain types of things? For professionals who are using their knife 8 or 10 hours a day or more, things like hardness really matter. If it's a home cook and you're cooking an hour or two here and there, it might not be as relevant. Personally, for myself, I use all kinds of knives. I have high carbon steel knives, which are easy to sharpen, but they tend to lose their edge a little bit more quickly than some of the other knives that I have. I have some, real traditional German style knives, Wüsthof Classic being a workhorse in the kitchen that I used for many, many years. I also have lots of Japanese style knives, and I really appreciate those for their weight, for the kind of more narrow spine, and also for the hardness of the steel. The steel in many of those knives tends to be a harder type steel, which means it also, while it keeps an edge for longer, it also makes it more difficult potentially when you have to sharpen and put an edge back on that blade. But for me, it's really just a matter of preference. I don't mind sharpening and honing my knife on a pretty regular basis. I like the feel of different types of steel, even cutting through different types of food. For people who are more plant-based, the good news is that since you're not cutting through, bones and tendons and other sorts of hard type items, your knives tend to stay sharper longer as long as they're cared for, cutting through vegetables and things like that. So those are some of the considerations. Next question here from Leslie. This is my first professional cooking course, and I want to learn more about balancing flavor and bringing in certain flavor profiles. I've seen several books on Amazon was wondering if you had a go-to book for creating different flavor profiles. We get this question a lot from our students. I would say, for me, the book that really kind of set me into a certain mindset thinking about flavor was a book called The Flavor Bible. There's also an updated version called The Vegetarian Flavor Bible. The two authors of that book happened to go vegetarian at some point in the last, 7 or 8 years or so, I want to say. But that is a book by Andrew Dornenberg and Karen Page. It's a classic within the culinary space. It really provides a very user-friendly way to explore flavors, to connect different flavors together. Some are very, when you look at the flavor pairing, some are very obvious and very classic, and some are very far out there going, wow, how would you know to combine those things? And of course, flavor combinations is always personal at the end. So regardless of what a book says or what a chef says, if it's not pleasing for you, then it's not, right? So you don't have to necessarily enjoy it if it's something that's not pleasing for you. So just always keep that in mind. Things that are supposed to taste good together might taste good or that way for many people, but not for everyone. And thank you, Patrick, for posting a link to the book there from Karen and Andrew, the Flavor Bible, or the Vegetarian Flavor Bible in this case. There's lots of other books on the subject of flavor. I know Gray Kuntz has a really amazing book called The Elements of Taste. Nick Sharma also has a brand new book around food and kind of developing flavor and texture on the palate as well. So all great considerations. Next question here from Kelly. Hi, Ken. When a recipe is too large for 6 people, I'm only 1 person, can the measurements be cut down by dividing by 6, for example? I understand that is not always suitable. So how do we adjust recipe sizes? So wonderful question. I think that, when you go from a recipe that serves, say, 4 to 6 to a recipe that serves 1, it's a lot more difficult than just doing like a cutting in half. So for instance, if you had, a cup of brown rice in a recipe, using 1/6 of a cup is just not going to be realistic. You're going to want to cook a little bit more than that. So my recommendation, Kelly, is really to start by looking at cutting recipes in half. So if a recipe serves 6, go ahead and cut that in half. It might make 3 servings. In your mind, you might think about that as being like a dinner and then a lunch. If it's something that's suitable for freezing, maybe you freeze it and then it becomes lunch in the next few weeks at some point. So I do a lot of batch cooking that way, where I'll make a huge batch of black beans, and then I'll turn part of that into black bean soup and part of it into tacos or enchiladas or some other thing. But for me, knowing that I have a variety is always also really useful. Next question here from Sarah. Hello again. I'm also curious about sea salt. Sea salt, Himalayan, pink salt, kosher salt, etc. What are the primary, or are they primarily interchangeable, or are they specific times when one ought to be used over the other? Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. So Sarah, salt is one of these questions we get a lot from students, in particular students in our plant-based programs who are looking for ways to reduce salt or kind of change the way they approach seasoning and salt usage more generally, and looking at building flavor in lots of different ways. Salt by and large is going to be, whether it's, pink salt from the Himalayas, or a rock salt from Utah, or a sea salt, or a flaked sea salt, or any of these types of variations of natural salts, they're going to be by and large 97, 98, 99 or more percent sodium chloride, right? It's really salt in a pure form, with the addition of some of those minerals like potassium and magnesium and calcium in particular, forming that other 1, 2, maybe 3% at the maximum. You have other types of mineral salts that might be higher, but most culinary salts tend to be a percentage or 2 other types of minerals. And those are the things that are responsible for some of those slight variations that you see in color for instance, the pink salt or salt that might be a little bit, grayish or a little bit kind of yellowish even. And those minerals are responsible for those colors, responsible also for some small variation in flavor. But by and large, it's salt. And if you add that to a liquid, it's going to it's going to dissolve and make that liquid in a more homogeneous way salty. If you use salt in a topical way to finish a dish, that's when some of these textures and some of these unique characteristics, I find, tend to really become more important. So I use those kind of more specialty salts, whether it's something for texture or for finishing flavor, more topically, because there is a textural component of having a big flake of salt on something that otherwise is not very salty, and it is nice to feel that on your food. It's just part of the kind of sensation, let's just say. When it comes to, I think, over salting food, it's pretty easy when you think about the sensation that you have in your mouth versus the amount of actual sodium that you're ingesting. Really, really big chunks of salt, not like flaky salt that dissolves easily, but big, like coarse chunks of salt. If it's overused, those can actually not dissolve and wind up being these big sodium bombs that you can probably chew and swallow and have actually a lot more sodium in your body than what your mouth ever experienced. Again, another reason why I like topical use of salt. It's like direct impact on your taste buds when you want to use that. Next question here. Hi, Ken. I'm looking to buy new cookware to match my new cooking skills. That's awesome. Do you recommend stainless steel? If so, what are your go-to brands? I'm happy to make an investment if it's good quality. Thanks. Well, I think you stated it really well. For high quality pans, for your new, cooking habits, your newfound passion for cooking, I would say it's really, if you can, it's good to make an investment in those pans. In terms of the brand of pans, I have lots of different brands that I like to use. I have opinions about those brands, but many of them function in very similar ways. So I'm a big fan of all-clad pans. I think that they are, for the cost, very, very high quality. They really kind of, I think, as a company, found a sweet spot in consumer friendliness and also being professional grade and having a certain weight that chefs like to work with, but also not quite so heavy that home cooks feel that they're too large or too cumbersome to deal with. So all-clad is a really strong go-to for me. For lower price pans that are also high quality, Cuisinart makes great pans. Calphalon makes excellent pans. There's a French company called Citram that makes really good pans that I have many of their pans. I used to do a lot of outside catering work, and their pans were awesome for catering, just very standard stainless steel, easy to clean, easy to transport, those sorts of things. But there are many brands out there of high quality stainless steel pans. I would say, the biggest consideration is making sure it has a pretty decent weight. The weight will help with heat distribution, will help with heat retention as well, help with any issues with just maintenance of the structure. Thin pans over time can warp or create kind of strange effects with how the bottom might buckle and things like this. So you just want to make sure that what you're getting is heavy enough that you don't have any issues on those fronts. Question from Marina. As I am approaching the end of my Plant Pro course, I'm wondering where to go from here. I'm not looking for a career as a chef, but would like to learn about advanced skills to build on what I've already learned. Any suggestions would be appreciated. I would say the great thing about cooking skills, and I've been cooking for 35 years almost now, started very young, is that it's a lifelong activity. The things that you're doing now and learning will not be the same things that you're practicing and learning in 5 or 10 years from now. And I think that the plant-based professional course provides an amazing foundation in terms of skills and knowledge and lots of other directions. Within that course, there are some areas I think in particular that if you wanted to dive into more advanced techniques that you could begin to explore a bit more. One of the areas of plant-based cooking that I really like to explore in particular are really two things I should mention. One is the area of fermentation and really getting into the wide variety of types of fermented products out there and becoming more comfortable fermenting a range of things, whether it's a sauce or your own sour cream or a plant-based cheese, or krauts and various other sorts of things. But it's always, for me, a certain threshold around people who begin to get into fermenting, feel like when they start, they have to follow it by the book. And when they get a certain comfort level, they see the edges of it a bit and begin to really understand the joys of all the things that come from fermenting. Another area I think of advanced skills within the plant-based space falls into low temperature cooking. So things that involve sous vide cooking, extended cooking times at low temperatures to help maintain the integrity of products, but kind of still break down and have some of those textural components that are interesting. So applying all those things that have been used in very, very high-end kitchens all around the world for years with low temperature cooking and using those to transform vegetables, to really understand texture and starches and maintenance of color, timing, these sorts of things becomes really, really key. Beyond that, I think in terms of advanced skills, one thing that I found, having been involved with food and cooking for a long time, is that what's old becomes new again. So a lot of the things that I think about as very foundational, very basic, very fundamental, I also will push myself and continually kind of force myself into positions where I have to understand what's more to learn in that space or what discipline might be required for me to take my skills even to the next level or to maintain them at a high level. So knife skills would be an example of that. Be easy for me just to kind of maintain the skills I have and not really grow. But I found, especially in the last few years, that forcing myself, challenging myself to get better, faster, safer, cleaner, all those things has made me a much better cook, even after having done it for many years. Next question here. Hi, Ken. Where do you see the role of a plant-based chef fit in the culinary world? Do you feel like the approach to whole food, plant-based cooking, eating, living is going to be more widely accepted? Tips on starting a whole food, plant-based personal chef business. Yeah, I can see that we are past the tipping point. I look at this landscape around plant-based, and I'm just so impressed with the level of attention and sort of the mainstream dialogue, the narrative that's now happening around plant-based foods and being more plant-centric, really kind of across the board. It's happening in popular culture and mass media. It's definitely proliferated in a way where we can't unring that bell, which is wonderful. I mean, this is an old movement. Nothing about this is really new. This is something that has underpinnings that go back a long time in terms of the social underpinnings of plant-based movements, not just the kind of nutritional or the environmental underpinnings. So I don't see it going anywhere. I see it growing. I see it as mainstreaming. I see increasingly as young people learn more about their food and where it comes from and how it's grown and who's handling it, and just the larger food system, it naturally leads people to be inquisitive, inquire more about other ways of eating, include plant-based diets. So in terms of that, I think that's all good. It's all good news for us. It's all good news for people who are on board with the plant-based approach and who see the utility and the value and the pleasure of all those things. In terms of starting a plant-based personal chef business, That's a great undertaking. I do have some experience in my distant past uh, as a personal chef. It was all based on very specific diet related things that I was able to, provide for in terms of that client relationship, which was, excellent. And a lot of that success in a business like that really depends on your ability to have a network and to know that you could have some number of clients and on a regular ongoing basis require those services from you. So personal chef business is great as long as you can kind of lock in that network and create that loyalty and not have it be a series of short stints where you wind up spending your time seeking clients, getting to know clients, figuring out how to work with them, only to have them say, oh, yeah, well, we're going to move on. That was fun for a month or two, but we're going to move on. So I always like the longer term clients. You get to know their families, you get to really watch them and help them adapt over time. It also helps ease them into or edge into the plant-based diet in some cases with greater success. Having that time to really understand, well, what do they like? What do they not like? I, for instance, had a personal chef client in the past who, loved a variety of vegetables and really was mostly particular about the things she liked raw and the things she liked cooked. And then the second barrier for her was really about knife cuts and about the ease at which she could eat these things. She liked things to be cut very, very small. She didn't like to take big bites of things. She didn't like to have one flavor. She liked to have a combination of flavors. So we moved away from, big chunks of roasted vegetables that were beautifully caramelized and this sorts of things to raw chopped salads, vinegared salads, combination of raw and cooked or cooked but cold, these sorts of things. It made for just a much, much better relationship. And she saw amazing health outcomes because her vegetable consumption went through the roof. We were able to, double or even in some cases triple her intake of certain vegetables just based on the format of her consumption, only based on this fact that we went back and forth and I really got to know what she was eating, what she was not eating, why she had a barrier eating certain things. So that becomes really important. That's how you build a business in that context. Next question here. When would I use steaming and when would I use boiling as a technique of cooking vegetables? Wouldn't boiling be a faster method of cooking and essentially do the same thing? Well, steaming is actually potentially faster because of the way convection currents and things work with steam. You can actually get, just as hot, if not hotter, with steam than with boiling water, believe it or not. So steam is perfectly fast. It's capable method of cooking, and because of all that movement and convection, you can actually, seriously burn yourself in a steamer. So there's no issues at all in terms of how effective it is. Really, one of the big questions around steaming versus boiling is what is the efficacy of retention of water-soluble vitamins based on that cooking method. So in other words, surrounding that product with very moist, hot air circulating quickly versus submerging that product in a liquid that has, maybe a higher tendency to leach out some of those water-soluble vitamins. So from a nutritional retention point of view, a lot of people do prefer steaming, but the real question for me always goes down to time, right? So you can steam something, for the right time and the right temperature and be perfect. You can also over steam something and be better off having blanched something in boiling water for a minute, right? So it's not that necessarily one technique is better than the other. It's really how do you apply that technique? What is the nature of the thing you're trying to achieve? And, if you're applying it properly, but, I use both methods. There's no reason why you should maybe feel confined to doing one or the other. I find steaming produces really wonderful results. And it's just, for me, even a little bit faster. You're bringing less water up to the boil. Next question, what is the suggested schedule to proceed with the course? So Denise, I'm not sure exactly what course you're in. We have students joining us here today from lots of different Ruby courses, our whole catalog of plant-based courses, as well as our non-plant-based courses. So if you could, oh, Patrick is saying Forks Ultimate. Great, Forks Ultimate, thank you. Patrick, our producer, just found you, Denise, and told me what course you're in. So you're in the Forks Ultimate course. That's a 90-day course. Recommended in that course, I would say, is you want to complete, on average, about 15 tasks a week. In my recollection, that course is just shy of 200 learning tasks. So if you look at the total number of days and the total number of tasks, I would say you want to really think about doing about 15, 10 to 20 tasks a week, let's call it. Most people report in Forks Over Knives course that they're spending about 5 or 7 hours a week cooking and spending time learning, watching videos, cooking, doing the activities, and those sorts of things. So when you think about budgeting your time, I would say if you want to spend 2 or 3 days kind of with a Ruby focus, that's probably a pretty good starting point for most people. Some of those tasks are going to be very fast, right? 5 minutes, 7 minutes, read something, watch a quick video, review this chart, that sort of a thing. Some tasks will involve cooking something, or we might have you go through a technique or cook a dish or that sort of a thing, and that might take you 90 minutes. So just depending on the task, they can vary greatly. So I always recommend for people, if you have a busy week, just look ahead in the course and kind of gauge for yourself what that might look like in terms of your own timing. Next question here from Nancy. Do you recommend people plan out and prep food for the week? Absolutely. This is a topic I've spoken about at length many, many times. My colleague, Chef Dan Merrick, who's one of our teammates here at Ruby, just did a live event a few weeks ago about the topic of, really, how do you do that? How do you set up your kitchen for success for the whole week through batch cooking? So if you hadn't had a chance to look at that live event, I'd highly recommend it. It really does kind of take you through start to finish, showing up with your groceries, having all of your containers ready to go, spending an afternoon cooking, and having just a huge amount of food for your refrigerator and your freezer for the rest of the week. I've been a huge fan of batch cooking since I was very young. It was one of the ways I kind of discovered early on that I could, prepare something and get a lot of pleasure out of preparing it and the process and serving dinner, but then having like leftovers the next day or putting some in the freezer. And the next week, you can reheat it if it's something that's easy to reheat. And everyone's really happy again because they have a super easy meal. It's something that's been already tested and tried and true, and certainly saves on time. I know probably the number one consideration for people that we talk to is just feeling, stretched on time. And having kids myself and having, a lifestyle that's otherwise very busy, I could totally relate. So I know what it's like when it's 4:30 or 5 and you don't really know what's happening for dinner, and the kids are asking, what's for dinner? And you're looking in the fridge. And for me, the way you can alleviate that is to know you have, batch cooked beans, grains, some prepped vegetables, some cut and washed greens for a salad, like all those things alleviate that concern pretty quickly. And Patrick, thank you for posting that link to Dan Merrick's batch cooking event. Super fun event. Had a lot of people view that event, found it very, very useful. Tony has a question. My pans seem to get more residue on them from oil-free sauteing, even when using a little water. Is there a clever trick to reduce or negate this? Or is it just it's a small negative in a healthier lifestyle? Well, gosh, Tony, I really like that approach. It is a small negative in a healthier lifestyle. I think, to have a little bit of staining on a pan is not the end of the world. If you want to maintain your pans in that ultimate kind of stainless steel polished mode, there are certainly cleaning products out there that will do that. One that has worked really well in the past for our students is a product called the Barkeeper's Friend, I think, which is like an abrasive type cleaner to use on stainless steel. So it has a little bit of a grit to it, and that's the thing that helps, I guess, take off that kind of discoloration, that kind of residue that some people see when they're heating their stainless steel pans without any oil, and otherwise doing that no oil cooking process. So yeah, but if you don't mind the aesthetics, it's fine. It doesn't actually change the way it cooks, as long as there's no residue that you can buff or polish off. It's not going to burn or do anything like that. So should be okay. Tanya asks, onions versus shallots. Growing up, I had never heard of shallots. Are they interchangeable? When and why would you use one over the other? Well, shallots are just another wonderful vegetable in the allium family. So if you look at things like various kinds of onions, there are many different types of onions, leeks, shallots, garlic, things like scapes or garlic scapes, chives. These are all foods in the same family. And for me, shallots, sure, they can be interchangeable with onions. Sometimes I'll do shallots and even include, shallots and onions and garlic. They're all going to contribute slightly different types of aromatics. For me, shallots are just a wonderful ingredient. They're underused. A lot of people have an idea that they're a fancy ingredient or they're a high-end ingredient. They're not. They're used regularly in street food in many parts of the world. So they're just a delicious, flavorful alternative or addition to onions. Onions are going to be less expensive. They're more popular. They produce them on a much, much larger scale. But there's no reason why, if you have shallots, why you couldn't use them. In fact, last night I was doing a fried rice dish and found myself without enough garlic, and I just wound up putting some extra shallots in, and it worked out great. It kind of boosted that overall kind of allium flavor, which was really, really nice. Next question. I routinely use up herbs in pesto and tomatoes in a compote, but both with oil. Is there a better substitute for oil that doesn't sacrifice the flavor or texture? Thank you for these events. When it comes to something like pesto, it's 100% possible to make a delicious pesto using, herbs, even some other green veggies. Sometimes I'll put some spinach or kale or tops or other things in my pesto just to kind of bulk. Conventionally, cheese and nuts and oil, but there's no reason why you couldn't, swap out that oil for just an increase in nuts and or adding some other thing that's going to help with that creaminess, that texture, that kind of, that unctuousness, that kind of, density that you get of flavor and color and texture, and that real flavor pop that you get with something like pesto. So if I were making a pesto and really wanted to have, say, a no oil pesto, I would still use nuts if that were acceptable. I would omit the cheese for a plant-based version, maybe add some nutritional yeast or something like that to add some of that flavor characteristic of a cheese, but otherwise really depend on soaked walnuts or soaked cashews for some of the texture and the creaminess. Pine nuts are great, but they're very, very spendy. So if you want to use other nuts, that's great. You can do pesto with lots of different types of nuts. I used to do a parsley pistachio pesto that was just amazing, tossed over freshly cooked potatoes or any other root vegetable. So just think about that oil being replaceable. If you do want that mouthfeel, adding nuts or seeds does keep that fat present. But if you don't want that, adding some cooked pureed white beans would certainly work in terms of texture. There's lots of things you can do to help build up that flavor. When you think about something like a compote, the oil in the compote is going to certainly add that luxurious texture, a little bit different than in like a pesto sort of context, because pesto has other things going for it that might impart some of that texture. If it's just tomatoes and you're depending on the oil for those tomatoes to have a certain texture, certain flavor, that would just really up the flavor of other things in those tomatoes. So, oven roasting garlic, having really heavy hand with your herbs, layering the herbs so you have a combination of those kind of heartier, more resinous herbs like thyme, and maybe some of the fresher herbs like fresh parsley. So really just about building as much flavor as you can within that context. Next question here from Laura. Hello, Chef Ken. What kinds of plant-based milk are most indicated for baking cakes and cookies, and for cooking other sweet types of recipes such as creme pâtissier? What plant-based milk varieties are best for bechamel or mayonnaise? Gosh, great questions in there. So, really all about plant-based milk. I would say when it comes to things like cakes and cookies, it almost depends a little bit on what you're doing. But for cakes, if it's something where I've got just kind of a standard cake recipe, a chocolate cake, let's call it, I'll use, in many cases, full-fat soy milk. I find that soy milk, because of the protein and the fat that it contains, does a really good job acting like dairy in many, many recipes. If that's not going to work for you, if you're not a person who uses soy, I would say certainly an almond milk might work well. It's going to be a little bit thinner, but still have a lot of that consistency and a lot of that texture that you might like. Probably less important in those sorts of examples. When it comes to things like pastry cream and other things, many of these you're going to want to think about the base being not just a plant-based milk, but maybe even something that comes from whipped soaked cashews or some other nut. It could be, even in some cases, an aquafaba base coming from the liquid that is the result of cooking chickpeas or other beans. It almost really depends on what the final application is. Things like bechamel and mayonnaise, for me, I almost go exclusively, cashews that have a whole lot of other aromatics layered in there. So I'll do mayonnaise that is counter cultured, so blend it, leave it out on the counter to culture and to bubble and begin to ferment. That's what creates that sourness. I would also add a lot of lemon to that, and sometimes some black pepper. It just kind of depends on what you like on that flavor profile there. Bechamel, I do kind of the straight Rubin classic cashew bechamel, adding some aromatics, some reduced white wine. If you use that, all add to the flavor there. When it comes to some of these other questions around baking and pastry, Laura, I might also suggest we have a amazing essential vegan desserts course with Fran Costigan. She's really truly the expert on all things plant-based baking and pastry. So you might even check out that course, or check out some of the work of Fran if you have additional questions about some of these baking and pastry questions. Next question coming in here from Carrie. How and when do we wash our produce to keep it clean and not rotting due to getting it wet? What do we clean after we buy? What do we clean right before we prepare? Oh gosh, we get a question like this all the time. It's a really tricky question to answer because so much of it has to do with the quality of the produce and some of the specifics around your your storage and things like this. I tend to, if I go to the farmer's market and come home with some fresh lettuces and things like that, if I know that those are my lettuces for the whole week, I'll tend to just wash them, dry them, and store them, and do it in a way that I know I'm not going to have any drainage issues or any issues with those leaves being too wet. That's the number one thing. Whenever you wash salad greens and then store them, if they're not dried well, they have a tendency to kind of go bad very, very quickly. So for me, if it's something delicate like those greens, I'll I'll rinse them, I'll spin them, I'll dry them, and I'll store them in one of my kind of produce bins with a cloth or some paper towel in there, just to help with all that moisture balancing. Other things like a tomato or something like that, I'm just not going to touch it until I'm ready to use it. It's going to sit on my countertop. I'm going to wait for it to get ripe. When I'm ready to cut into it, I'm going to give it a rinse. I'm just going to cut into it. I'm not going to wash it in advance or put it in the fridge or do anything like that. It really depends on the produce. For things like root vegetables and some of those hardier things, they can just be put away. I'll oftentimes wash them. They need to be peeled. They can be peeled. Sometimes they just need a good scrub, honestly, because I sometimes like those skins depending on how tough it is or how thick it is or what the product is itself. One of the things I'll just caution against is, people go and they buy lots and lots of beautiful produce. And one of the things I like about that prep portion after purchase is it really kind of triggers your brain to remember why you bought it and what it is you might do with it. So sometimes that step just helps me increase my consumption, knowing that I have a cauliflower that I took home, I rinsed it, and instead of letting it sit whole, I've already got it cut into florets, because that's probably the way I'm going to cook it, right? So might as well do it and save that time and not have to look in the fridge and say, oh yeah, there's a cauliflower, versus saying, oh yeah, there's florets. All I have to do is throw those in a saute pan or throw them in a steamer basket and I'm done. It's literally a 30-second transaction at that point. Jim has a question. How can I get the most value from this course? I would say, Jim, showing up to live events is one great way. Making sure that when you complete an activity or an assignment, that you really give it your all, that you really approach the activity and only complete it when you're ready to do so, not because it's your first time. We have a lot of students who sometimes submit things and they submit it knowing they didn't do a good job, that they probably should have done it again. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we always tell students, take the time. If you need to practice something 2 or 3 times before you send it to us, perfectly acceptable. That's why you're here. If you were perfect your first time, you probably wouldn't need to go to cooking school, right? So we're here to help support. We want to make sure that when you do show up, that you've got your best foot forward. Do take advantage also of any QA within each task. Every single task in every course has an opportunity to ask a question and get a response, either from a classmate or from the team of chef instructors we have. So use that. Sometimes people find when they click on the task Q&A to ask a question, they find that the question has already been asked and answered. And in that case, it's really great because they show up and, well, they've got their answer, right? So that's really useful. Other than that, Jim, I would just say, stay in touch. The more you engage, if you have specific questions for any of our chef instructors, sending in a support ticket and getting more detail is always a good idea. Something that we like to do, for sure. Many of us come from the more conventional brick and mortar culinary teaching space where, we used to have the student right in front of us. So having the opportunity to do that certainly still, makes us feel really good. Other than that, Jim, I would just say, just keep doing what you're doing, showing up to live events, asking questions, supporting, your own learning as you're progressing. And if you're hitting any roadblocks or any friction, also feel free to reach out and say, hey, it was going so well, and now I've slowed down. Do you have any suggestions? Anything you could put back on me to get back on track? Janine asked, "Good morning, chef. I was wondering if there are advantages to cooking beans over using canned." Yeah, there's a few great advantages to preparing your own beans from dried beans versus purchasing canned. I would say the first, reason would be, you can save some money. Um, Canned beans I know aren't tremendously expensive, but the amount of beans you get from, say, 1 pound of dried beans is going to be a significant multiple of what you'd get from a single can of beans at much less cost. So, from the economics of it, dried beans just make a whole lot of sense. Um, in terms of controlling the flavor and the outcomes, that's another real good reason to go for the dried beans that you soak or rehydrate and then simmer or cook yourself. Being able to control the level of salt is important to people. Also, to have the ability to season and flavor that to your liking is important to people. And having no additional preservatives, nothing in there that would make it in any way something other than just beans and water. Those are also going to be important things. I would say, for many people, beans and cooking beans is kind of one of those things that is solved when you start batch cooking. So for me, I cook every Sunday for a few hours. 9 times out of 10, beans are something I'm simmering and something I'm cooking, sometimes even multiple pots. I know that I can have a big pot of beans simmering for an hour or 90 minutes, and that's going to produce a lot of food. I can have the same time simmering, a small amount of beans. So I'd rather do it, put them away, have a plan for using them, knowing that it's low cost, high impact for me. Some people have a concern with canned beans, with the things like BPA or things like the lining in the can, whether it's BPA or not. So using your own beans eliminates all those conversations. Hi, Chef Ken. I've been saving aquafaba in my freezer. This past week, I needed half a cup, but the smallest jar I had more than that in it. Is it possible to refreeze aquafaba once it has been unthawed, maybe boiling it first? Great question. I would say aquafaba is pretty durable, right? It doesn't have any of the finickiness that you get with egg whites. That's one of the great things about aquafaba. You could, if it deflates, you can reinflate it. If it breaks, you could fix it. All these sorts of things. So I have never myself, frozen and thawed and refrozen aquafaba liquid. I imagine it would work just fine. I would say that mentioning boiling it, kind of resonates with me, because one of the things I found that when I make my own aquafaba liquid versus using the liquid from a can, let's say, is that the greatest success I get with that is through really reducing that liquid so it becomes thicker, and you get a much denser, more luxurious, kind of more sheen on your aquafaba, because you have more protein, more soluble protein in that liquid for your volume or for your weight than if it were less concentrated. So hopefully that makes sense. But certainly if it's not working, reducing it sometimes helps. Sarah asks, "Hello, Chef. I'm new to the world of quality oils and vinegars, and I'm curious what to look for when shopping. Is quality primarily in direct proportion to cost? Can high quality products be found in common grocery stores, or are they specialty items?" When it comes to oils, a lot of people are looking very specifically for like high quality olive oil or cold pressed oils and things like this. I would say that cost will be a consideration. There's definitely going to be some correlation between higher quality oils and higher priced oils. to a certain point. I know from having purchased a lot of olive oil in my day that there are $30 bottles out there that taste better than $60 bottles, and there's $10 bottles that taste better than $30 bottles from a flavor perspective. In terms of quality, there's official sort of designations that each oil producer is going to put on the oil in terms of designating or referring to the quality. With something like olive oil, you oftentimes see the extra virgin olive oil moniker, which really speaks to some legal specifications around minimum or maximum amounts of oleic acid, even mineral content and some other content, markers within that oil, versus going with oils that might be a lower quality oil with higher oleic acid, or a pumice oil that's even extracted using non-mechanical extraction, or blended oils that use olive oil plus some other low-cost neutral vegetable oil, things like this. When it comes to vinegars, that's also a whole other category. You can get very high-end, very kind of creative in your vinegar use. I happen to love vinegars for their flavor range. Amazing vinegars. I have Serrano chili vinegars. I have different kinds of wine vinegars, champagne vinegars, all different things. They're typically not going to be as pricey as olive oils. You're also going to use, depending on how much you're using vinegar, you're going to use a fairly small amount. So I love experimenting with those sorts of things. Vinegars make a great way to add flavor. Acidity is something I talk about a lot in terms of the necessity of acidity in plant-based diets that can be very base and very, kind of grounded in flavors, oftentimes with a lot of nuts and seeds and grains and beans and those sorts of things. So acidity can help lift and bring life and light to foods. So I talk about that a lot. And yeah, you should be able to find these at common grocery stores. There's no need to spend too much money on oils or vinegars. If you find a good quality oil or vinegar, and it's something that you like, just take a picture of it. That way, when you're shopping again, you can remember which one you were using. But any decent supermarket should have a pretty good selection of products for you to work with. All right, so Susan asked, how do we calculate calories and nutrition content for recipes on our own? Great question. There are lots of tools to plug in your inputs, essentially. So I would say the best thing to do is just to plug into one of those database type cooking tools, which would essentially allow you, if you were cooking, to input the ingredients that you were using, and then to have that tie into a database that would then create an output for the specific nutritionals, or that nutritional panel, what they call it, on the other side. So it's not going to be something that's super intuitive necessarily. It's got to be database driven. Otherwise you're spending a lot of time looking up, well, how many calories are in a half a cup of celery? How many grams of protein are in a quarter cup of dried lentils, these sorts of things. Whereas those databases, once you draw it in, will automatically do some of those calculations for you. Robert asked, will there be discussions, demonstrations, or recipes for grilling without oil? I'm very interested in no oil cooking techniques. We haven't ever done anything specifically around grilling without oil, but the good news is that that's one of the absolute easiest techniques to do without any oil. So when I think about grilling without oil, it means just putting either marinated or dry rubbed vegetables directly over a live fire on a grill, or if you don't have that, onto a grill pan for those grill marks. Not really grilling, but if that's the effect that you're looking for, I can totally understand. But really grilling from a technique point of view, because you don't have the issues with the entirety of the surface of the pan, you can have really great results with grilled vegetables, vegetable kebabs, even just grilling in, kind of one of those pans designed for the grill top for vegetables, kind of a perforated pan that looks like a wok with, these slats or these holes in it, sort of a thing. So for me, it's a great technique. When I think about techniques that are going to build flavor and help develop character in foods, grilling is certainly on that list because of all the high temperature potential. Next question here from Laura. What function does salt have in baking, especially in sweet preparations such as cakes and cookies? Does it help food rise along with yeast? Or in the case of sweet foods with baking powder and soda, or does it play a different role? Interesting question. So salt will actually diminish the ability for yeast to rise. So yeasted foods or yeasted doughs will actually have less leavening power, relatively less leavening power, I should say, if they're salted versus non-salted. Salted tends to just diminish that by a bit. More so in certain types of leavened or yeasted products than others. So it's not really so much about the rising or the yeast action. Salt is going to help make the food just kind of taste more interesting. In the case of sweets, salt will actually help accentuate and punctuate the sweetness of that food. So it's kind of interesting that something salty, because it creates that kind of salivary gland response, overall still makes food more appealing, and it creates those sweet notes, makes them a little bit more apparent. I would say you can easily overdo it. You don't want to make something that's sweet with a little bit of salt go from, wow, that's kind of cool, salty sweet, to, wow, that's just salty, and now it's fighting with the sweetness. So no reason to do that. You don't need salt to rise food. Baking powder works from basically a chemical reaction with the addition of water and heat. So not dependent on salt at all. Next question. I'm thinking about switching careers and to become a chef. Would you recommend going to traditional culinary school first? And if so, which would you recommend? So, Brittany, it's an important question, the one that you're asking. I think for a lot of people in the past, people who were seeking that career as a chef, traditional brick and mortar culinary school was sort of the only option for people. And I spent a long time, a big part of my career, working at those schools and opening and running those schools. Many people on the Rouxbe team also did that in our past. I'll say that, certainly it's a great option for some people still. There are still amazing academic institutions out there training chefs today, whether it's community colleges or, the Ivy League type culinary schools like the Culinary Institute of America or the Johnson & Wales, those sorts of organizations. Those exist, and they're going to have an important role to play in terms of education. But I'll say that part of the reason why we do Rouxbe and why we're also passionate about Rouxbe is to disrupt that assumption and to say that for some people, you don't need to go spend 6 months or a year or 2 years or 4 years, and you don't need to spend $20 or $40 or $80,000. For some people, you can come to Rouxbe or some other online option, get your basics and your foundations, and then go get a job and work and continually grow and expand and advance without debt, without having to have had that formal in-person instructional experience, and more leveraging what we've been able to build on Rouxbe over the last 15 years now to provide some of that foundation. So every type of learner is different. I'm not going to say this is the only way to learn or that go into a brick and mortar culinary school is the only way to learn, but it's good to have options. It's good to know what the cost benefits are. It's good to know that now that's not the only pathway in. You don't have to go and have that experience to be eligible to work in the industry. Not by a long shot. Can you suggest a really good sharpening steel from QD? Oh gosh, I still use a Wusthof steel that I think I got many years ago, maybe 7 or 10 years ago. That's a great steel. I've also used ceramic steels in the past. Those are great. Steels are really good for honing, but when it's time to sharpen, you got to put that knife onto a stone or a tri-stone or some other actual sharpening tool, because a honing steel, sometimes called a sharpening steel, doesn't really sharpen. It's really more about honing and finishing that blade versus wearing away metal to change the nature of the edge there. Question from Deanne here. Hi, I'm fairly new to the plant-based community and learning to cook with no oils. Learning to cook with no oils at all. It has been great, but occasionally I make something that just needs a touch of oil. What oil would be the best to use if I absolutely need a little bit for a recipe? I would say, Deanne, that's going to be largely up to you. If you look at kind of the medical literature about oils that have some health supportive qualities, obviously olive oil is pretty high on that list. So if you did want to add oil, that'd be an oil I'd be perfectly fine recommending. That's an oil that I use at home. High quality olive oil. I like it for the flavor, not necessarily just for the functionality it provides, but I also do love the flavor of oil still. Next question here. I'm going to buy a pasta machine and a bamboo steamer for the class. Do you have a recommendation for each? The pasta machine that I have is the brand called Atlas. It is actually the same pasta machine I've been using for 33 years. So it will stand the test of time if they're maintained. There are lots of great brands out there. Atlas just happens to be the brand that I've used and just happened to purchase when I was a teenager. Still have that one. In terms of bamboo steamers, I don't think there's very many name brand stackable steamers out there. Many of them, I think, just come from Asian food markets. If you have international market, oftentimes they'll have things like this. Cookware stores might have a multi-tier stackable type bamboo steamer, but I don't have a brand on mine. I'm not even sure it has a brand name. Next question from Barbara. Hello, I'm utterly new to plant-based cooking. What do you believe is the most important cooking skills to master in order to create a tasty meal? So Barbara, I don't want to overcompensate, but I don't think you need mastery to cook a good meal. I think you can be a really good cook without being a master in the kitchen. So I just want everyone to dial back a little bit of the expectation that we're expecting from people. Many of our students, we have no expectation of mastery. We want you to be comfortable and confident. We want you to make foods that make you feel good, that fit your lifestyle, that help you learn and grow. If you're more professionally oriented, you want cooks, foods that challenge you, foods that help expand your repertoire, things that you can rely on professionally. But for me, it's really more about, let's figure out, Barbara, those foods that you define as tasty, those foods that if you were able to prepare them yourself, you would think would be a huge win, that your family would like to enjoy, or you would feel good to share with someone, this sort of thing. In terms of skills, I would say one really important skill is really going to revolve around using a knife, cutting up vegetables, being comfortable and confident using a knife. It's a huge barrier for many people, but one of the things we overwhelmingly hear from students is that once they became more comfortable with a knife, a lot of the other things from a cooking perspective that used to give them anxiety went away. All of a sudden, cooking was faster, it was cleaner, they didn't have anxiety around cutting themselves, their vegetables were the right size, so they cooked at the right time and temperature. All these things kind of begin to work together. So, knife skills, I would say basic cooking techniques. We go through moist and dry heat cooking, roasting, steaming, sweating. Those are the basics that provide the underpinnings for good food. Next question, how does Rubin measure citrus in recipes? How many tablespoons are typically in the juice of one lemon. Our lemons grow huge. I have one on my counter that weighs 4.4 ounces and is 4 inches in diameter. Wow. I would love to see that lemon, Shelly. That sounds amazing. Um, think about the lemon that you see, that very, what you would probably call a very sad lemon that you would see at the supermarket, that is going to really have, maybe an ounce and a half of juice, right? You think about a lemon and you squeeze it, you're going to get 3 tablespoons, maybe 4 tablespoons out of that lemon. Of course, some are going to be drier, some are going to be a lot more juicy and these sorts of things. But a lot of the reasons why we're maybe suggesting to add lemon of a certain amount to a recipe is not because there's some magic thing that happens between 1 ounce and 1.5 ounces of lemon juice, but because we're going for a certain flavor. So my recommendation would be, when you see a recipe that calls for the juice of 1 lemon, approximate what that might look like. Again, probably a few tablespoons, but really more than that, ask yourself, wow, this dish is obviously going to have a big lemon flavor profile. Do I taste that lemon? Did I put the lemon in, but I don't taste it? So add some more. Or wow, I put it in, that's too much. Next time I make it, I'm probably not going to add as much. So the goal here would be just to get that flavor and that amount to kind of line up so that it works with the rest of the dish. Whenever you have the juice of 1 lemon in a recipe, that's going to be a fairly good amount of acid. So that should be an impactful part of the dish, something that can't be ignored. So have fun with that. Next question here. I'm excited to be in the Forks Over Knives course to accelerate my transition to whole food plant-based eating exclusively. Will you be going over the course outline or process today? So Francine, we used to do welcome calls for all the Forks Over Knives classes, and which just turned out to have so many people and so many starts that we started to not do those, and really depending on the course itself to drive some of that process. So we're really excited to have you join. If you have any particular questions around the course, we're always happy to help. If you go into the live event gallery, you'll see many, many examples of previous Forks Over Knives sessions that provide a lot of Q&A, a lot of conversation. I would say the big questions for people coming into any course, not just Forks Over Knives, has to do with people who have questions around the timing of the course, like how fast do I need to go to stay on pace. Typically, we tell people with Forks Over Knives, you're going to want to do about 10 to 20 tasks a week, a few tasks a day. That becomes really important. We also get a lot of questions from students around making modifications or substitutions. So if you do need to make modifications, you're perfectly permitted to, as long as they don't change the essential core technique that we're looking at. So you want to swap dill for basil, you want to add more onions, you want to take the garlic away, that's all fair game. But if we're teaching you how to make a whole grain, or how to work in a certain way with a certain product, don't remove that core product. That's going to remove the technique itself. Next question here. When should we add miso to soup? I had recently heard that it should be at the end, after it is off the heat, to prevent bitterness and preserve the probiotic effects. Any thoughts? Yeah, well, miso does definitely lose its potency in terms of a probiotic if it's boiled. So the typical base of the broth minus the miso typically gets thinned out with some warm or hot water to make a little bit of a thinner paste, and that gets stirred in after the miso is off the heat. And that's to essentially keep the miso and those probiotic features of it active and alive, and then also not to diminish the flavor of the miso. Once you boil the miso, it's going to mute or diminish that flavor just a little bit. Of course, miso has the flavor, a great flavor still, even if it is boiled. So sometimes you see miso used as a glaze, as a coating, as a thing, where it does certainly exceed that temperature. And in those cases, you're using it just for that flavor, not for any probiotic type benefit potentially. Another question here is from Tony. Is there an easy way to identify ingredients that aren't whole food plant-based, like cocoa powder, tofu, nutritional yeast, I'm assuming, or baking powder? There's so much conflicting advice online. It seems some advice just suits the advisor. I'm hoping there's a simple, clear guide. Yeah, this is complex, Tony. I would say in part because there's just some fundamental disagreements about what makes a food whole versus processed. For instance, if you take an orange and you peel it, it's technically not a whole food anymore. You've taken the peel off. If you don't eat those seeds off, it's not a whole food. So, there's some fine lines here. You don't eat the core of an apple, let's just say. So it's not really the entire thing. In the case of something like cocoa, yeah, you're not eating the exterior of the cocoa. When you're eating cocoa powder, you're also not having any of the cocoa butter, so the oil, the lipids from the cocoa. So it is not whole, but you're not processing it in a way that requires any fancy equipment or chemicals or anything of this sort. So for me personally, I put things like cocoa and tofu into minimally processed categories. These are foods that have been produced for many hundreds of years without equipment. They can be done at home under home cooking conditions. Tofu is essentially just ground soybeans with a coagulant, right? So you're only really removing the solids from the soy that didn't make its way out into the soy milk that you use to coagulate to make your tofu. So tofu is another one of those foods where I'm actually on the fence. I know Forks Over Knives and others would say you want to limit your consumption, but that's pretty darn close to a whole food for me, given the way it's produced, given the fact that I've made it myself and gone, wow, that's actually a pretty simple process, like 3 ingredients sort of a thing. When it comes to things like baking powder, those are just chemical utilities. You're going to have a teaspoon of that here and there in terms of foods. Those are really just like chemicals from the earth. So the same way salt would be a chemical from the earth, like baking powder, baking soda are going to be kind of similar in those ways. There might be a few small niggly foods that we can argue about. Are they whole food? Are they not whole food? Is it processed? Is it not processed? But the reality is that when we cook, we process foods. When we peel things, we process them. When we puree them, we process them. When we ferment, we process. So I'm not anti-process across the board. I do want to maintain foods in as whole of form as possible. But in some cases, processing can actually be a benefit to foods. In some cases, like with cooking, can make some vitamins more nutrient available, as an example. I'm going to go ahead and just have one more question before we sign off here. Last question here we'll take from Olga. For health reasons, I am not having soy and gluten, but would love to try all the recipes for my family. I do not mind taking it again with substitutions that I have. Do you think that will be something that I can do? Sure. I mean, Olga, nothing stops you in the course from practicing, doing lots of things. I would say anything you want to do for a grade, that's something that you can only do once because we have our team and our time involved. But if you want to go back and make a recipe again, knock yourself out. That sounds great. We always encourage our students to go back and try recipes, test recipes, modify them, adapt them for their family, these sorts of things. Always works really, really well. Well, that does it for today. We're running out of time. Really just wanted to thank all of you for joining. Had some really amazing questions come in. Just wanted to also thank all of you who have come back to multiple live events. I like seeing familiar faces at these events. Really great to see you coming back with questioning that shows growth and change in your culinary worldview. Really, really exciting to see. If there's something I didn't get to that you absolutely want to hear about, please do reach out to us either through our courses or through contacting our customer service team directly. We're always happy to help. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you in class, and take care. Happy cooking.